Hello and welcome to this edition of the Vermont Report on Palestine-Israel. I'm Mark Hage. Our first report tonight comes from Bassam Ouda, a young and courageous Palestinian journalist who has been reporting from Gaza since the start of Israel's genocide. Next, there is testimony from Dr. Nizam Mahmoud. He was offered the opportunity to speak about his experiences and what he witnessed in Gaza before a special committee of Great Britain's Parliament. His testimony as a doctor treating patients is both riveting and chilling. Our third report comes from one of my favorite sources, The Listening Post and Al Jazeera, and it examines the challenges that Israeli soldiers are now facing when they travel abroad. Many of these soldiers, as you'll learn, posted images and videos of the war crimes they committed in Gaza on social media, and now it is coming back to haunt them. So we'll begin with Palestinian journalist Bassam Ouda, reporting from Gaza.
Hi everyone, this is Bassam. I am still alive and talking to you from Gaza Strip, where more than 70% of the residential buildings were destroyed in a 1 year of ongoing genocide. But the question now is, where can the people who used to live in these neighborhoods and survived the destruction and the genocide live after all of this? After returning back to their neighborhoods in Khan Yunis, for example, finding their homes and their whole streets rubble like this.
تعالوا 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 تعالوا، ايش بتزحلقوا؟ وين بتزحلقوا؟ اشوف وين ساكنين؟ شو صار في داركم؟
انحرقت.
حرقت الدار؟
لا انحرقت، احنا نصها انحرقت، احنا لا نصها وقعت ونصها كويس. احنا دارنا كلها انقصفت. هي
طب وين عايشين؟
احنا احنا هنا عشان احنا ضايلين على نص دار.
عايشين في نص الدار؟
هاي بيتنا. هاي بيتي قدامك، بيتي مكون من 6 طوابق. 70 سنة أنا من الشقة والبقى، يعني لما علمت أولادي وجوزت أولادي وبنيت لهم، في لحظة مسحوا لي إياها بمحايا. 7 طوابق، هذه 70 سنة أنا ببني فيهم، مش يوم ويومين و3 و4.
أول ما أجيت هنا بطلع مش عارفة إشي، بس ما كنتش متخيلة الصورة اللي لما أجيت وشفتها بعيني. حسيت إني ضايعة، يعني ماليش بيت، البيت اللي كان قويني وكنت بتمنى أرجع له لقيته رايح.
بيت مدمر هي، فيش غير هذه سطرنا، حطينا الشادر، طايح الدار كلها، هي طلعتنا ولا شباك ولا باب ولا شيء.
ورغم هيك سكنت فيه؟
ولا رغم هيك وين بدي اسكن انا؟ لا في معاي لا اجار ولا معيش ولا اي حاجه، ايش وين بدنا نروح انا؟
عملت درج هنا في 3 ايام وبعدين بعمل مدخل، وانا عملت مدخل. تفضل. يعني الشقة رايحة بس ضايل الغرفة، بمشي حالي فيه. أحسن من الخير.
هذا البيت استلمته في 2015. هذا غرفة ابني كان قاعد فيها، كان فيها تسريحة والخزانة. كنا عايشين فيه، كنا سعداء مع بعض أنا وأولادي وجوزي، وكنا يعني مرتاحين والحمد لله. هي كل أجت الحرب دمرت كل أحلامنا وكل حياتنا.
كيف هلقيت عايش؟ وين عايشة هلقيت؟
هينا عايشة بخيمة أنا وبتعذب ليل ونهار من الشمس ومن الدبان ومن الرمل.
مين عايش في الدار حاليا هلا؟
جوزي أبو ضياء ومعاه ولدين عايشين، لأنه البيت مكشوف، ما بينفعش أنا النسوان نعيش هنا في البيت. لحتى الآن لسه أواعينا تحت الردم مكومات، مش قادرين نطلعهن. هاي الجبال هذول اللي شفتيهم كل اللي تحتهم أواعي، إن حرامات أواعي أغراضنا كله لسه مكوم تحت الردم.
شغل البلدية الآن اللي هي مركزة في موضوع إنه فتح الشوارع بشكل يسير، لأنه في اللي هي معوقات كبيرة في هذا الجانب، منها موضوع هي التنسيق. لما بنحكي عن إزالة ركام بالكامل، لأن إمكانية المجريات البلدية جدا متواضعة ومحدودة.
شو بصير لو ما نسقته؟ مثلا لو دخلت الآلية تفتح إشي بدون ما تنسق،
تكون معرضة لخطر كثير كبير، منها ممكن اللي هي إنه يتم اللي هي استهدافها أو قصفها، ممكن منها يكون اللي هي طبعا اللي هي المسيرات تيجي اللي هي على الفرق العاملة.
ولا إشي بيقدر يطول. الطوابق هي لا تسمح لأي بني آدم، أنا جسمي نحيف ما بستطيعش أمرق فيها. أنا هلقيت قاعد هنا، هيني قاعد في العريشة هذه، ما قدرنا نعيش في البحر خالص، مشاكل في البحر كثيرة. أنا قاعد بحاول أسس أنا أجيب لأولادي ومرتي وأولادي يسكنوا هنا. بديت بداية هنا، مطرت علي المطرة، لقيت النتفة هذه قعدت فيها لحتى أني أتم تكملة العريشة، أقعد أنا وأولادي فيها.
على ركام الدار؟
على الركام، بدي أقعد على الركام أفضل لي.
شو معك أغراض هان؟ هات احكي لنا.
والله ما شنطتي وأكل يعني وملابس والمصحف اللي بقرا فيه.
طب بخوفش يا عم المكان اللي انت؟
والله الساتر هو الله، من ناحية بخوفش لكن الساتر هو الله.
بالنسبة اللي هي الأهالي ورجعتهم بيرجعوا على أماكن تعتبر خطرة، مليئة بالركام، مليئة بمخلفات الحرب، وهي رجعتهم للأمانة يعني على عاتقهم الشخصي.
As you can see here, people, because of the lack of the options, we don't have any places to go to. And Mawasi area is not enough. Building tents is not so practical, you know. You can't live in a tent or in the same tent for more than 6 months or 7 months. So people now are returning back to their homes and trying to rebuild anything, like any wall. Let me show you this neighbor. Look there. This neighbor, for example, is trying to build a room using the blocks of his destroyed home.
مقدوم فصل الشتاء موسم اللي هي الأمطار، هذا ممكن يؤدي لانهيارات كبيرة في موضوع الأبنية اللي هي أصلا مبتدئة، وصعب إنه الأهل يرجعوا يعيدوها من ثاني إلا بمعاينة لها بالكامل عشان نضمن سلامة هذه المنشآت وعودة الناس هنا. هذه الأماكن طبعا غير مهيئة لأي مقومات أو لأبسط مقومات الحياة، لأنه ما غير مزودة بالمياه الصالحة للشرب، غير مزودة اللي هي بشبكات صرف صحي، شوارعها كلها مليئة بالركام واللي هي الردم والنفايات والمخلفات عن الحرب.
عملت الماسورة هذا الصبح برضه عشان قصة الحمام، وبحط هنا أحجار، بصفط أحجار 6 مداميك، بعدين بحط بطانية وبقضي غرض يعني، بمشي أمور. فالواحد يعني ما يغرقش في شبر زي ما بيقولوها، دبر حاله، بدك تمشي حاله. فلسه أنا بشتغل أول يوم يعني أخش الشقة لسه أنظف، فإنجاز هذا اللي عملته أنا يعني.
Each time I come to this place or to random places in Khan Younis, I just got fascinated from the amount of bravery and resilience that the people have. Here behind me is a home. The first floor is destroyed and there is no entrance for the home. So people put a stairs here, opened a door into the wall of the next floor and kept their plants alive. مين صاحب فكرة الدرج هذا؟
أبوي دعمه.
طب شايف إنه صح الواحد يرجع حتى لو في دمار؟
هيك أحسن. ما إحنا كنا قاعدين عند الناس قبلها وفي الدار أحسن.
طب ما هي مدمرة.
دارنا أحسن من أي مكان.
اللي بيطلع من داره بنقل مقداره. أنا بقول أنا أقعد على الركام أفضل ما أقعد في قصر. لأنه بيت، ما حدش بيقول لي اطلع، ما حدش بيقول لي وين أنت، ما حدش بيقول لي وين، لا بدفع أجار ولا بدفع حاجة.
اللي خلاني أرجع المرمطة، اتمرمطت يعني. غرفة في داري أحسن من قصر برا بالنسبة لي يعني. واللي صار يعني هذا من غزة إشي كبير عظيم، مش مشكلة اللي سووه، عادي جدا. فيش مشكلة، الدور بترجع تاني بتنبني.
وأنا بصور شفت هناك ناس بيعمروا.
والله غصب عنكم، أنا غصب عنهم. أنا عمرها مرة ومرتين و10. عندنا نعمر فيها اليوم لقيام وقاعدين لهم هان قاعدين.
بتمنى يبنوا لنا بيوتنا زي ما كانت ونعيش بأمن وسلام زي ما باقي كل الدول عايشة. ليش إحنا ملناش حق؟ إحنا زي الناس. إحنا بدنا حقنا بس نعيش زي الناس، بس بدناش إشي تاني.
احكوا لي شو بتعملوا هنا؟ شو
نتزحلق.
مبسوطين؟ طيب مش خايفين في فتحة هان؟ مش خايفين مثلا تقعوا فيها إشي؟
الشقة التاني.
طب ما حدش حكى لكم إنه خطر تتزحلقوا في مكان فيه ركام مثلا؟ خطر ولا مش خطر؟ خطر. طب ليه بتتزحلقوا؟
عشان فيش مراجيح.
فيش مراجيح؟ طب يلا ماشي، سلام، شكرا. بلا حل، أطفال غزة بدون حل. بس منطقي، بتقدرش ترد عليه، بيحكي لك فيش مراجيح فبتزحلق على ركام البيت.
What I think I found particularly disturbing was that a bomb would drop maybe on a crowded, tented area, and then the drones would come down and...
Please take your time. We're incredibly grateful. We'd like to start the very first session of the International Development Select Committee. It is a new committee that we've got here for this new Parliament, and it is my great honour that our very first witness is Professor Nazim Mahmood, who is a Professor of Transplant Surgery. But Nazim, you're here in front of us because you have recently returned from Gaza and doing some work in the hospitals over there. We really appreciate you coming and speaking to us today. It's very difficult to get first-hand testimony, obviously, about what's going on in Gaza at the moment. So thank you for coming and sort of sharing your experiences. I wonder if you could sort of properly introduce yourself and what you were actually doing out there and when you came back.
Yes, so I'm no longer a professor of transplant surgery. I retired from the NHS a couple of years ago. And I've spent my time doing work overseas. So I had a month in Gaza, mid-August to mid-September, working in Nasser Hospital with medical aid for Palestinians. And I'm happy to tell you about my experiences there.
Please, tell us, so when did you go? Why did you go?
Why did I go? Because I thought I had the skill set that could help. I did, when I was sitting in the convoy going in across the border, I did have second thoughts, but it was too late then to get out of the convoy. And I think when we crossed the border, the first thing was really a complete sense of shock.
What did you see? What did you smell?
You see a landscape that looks as though it reminded me of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Devastation, buildings reduced to rubble for miles around as far as you can see. Nothing growing, no people, a few looters here and there, but nothing. You drive through that for about 20 minutes, and then you get to the central part of southern Gaza, which was the designated the green zone. I can't bring myself to call it the safe zone or humanitarian zone because it was neither. That green zone houses about 1.3 million people.
What sort of area is that?
It's probably about the size of the City of London. You can walk across it fairly easily if it was safe to do so. And a large part of it comprises of tents. And when I say tents, some of those are proper tents. Many of them are just pieces of carpet and plastic stuck onto sticks. And these are in the middle of the road, side of the road, every possible space. There's no running water, no sanitation, no electricity, obviously. And people are having to roll those up and move on at very, very short notice. Time and time again, most people have moved 6 or 7 times.
What does it sound, smell?
Well, the sound is mainly of two things. One is drones, so there's constant drones. And the drones existed before October last year. It's been a feature of Palestinian life for some time. But now the drones inspire fear, I think, and they inspire fear in me. And when I used to debate about sleeping outside on the stairs or inside in this very crowded hot room, part of that decision was whether the drones had the ability to pick me off when I was on the stairs.
Identify you?
Sorry?
Identify you?
No, shoot me. So that's what they do. Those drones are surveillance drones, but they are also drones that shoot people regularly. And I can tell you more about some of the people I've operated on who experienced that. So you have this constant whine, which is very psychologically very affecting because it represents danger and it's constantly there. And the other sound that you hear are bombs, which were going off every hour or two throughout the month that I was there. And we spent the whole month in the hospital. We deemed it not safe to travel, and we were aware that there was a curfew, so we wanted to be in the hospital if casualties arrived at night. We did have a guest house. We didn't want to stay there, partly because of the travel, but also because one of the MAP guest houses had been bombed in January of this year. So we stayed in the hospital, and a missile strike or an artillery shell would explode in the vicinity and the whole building would shake. Windows would rattle. You would look out the window or run outside to see how close it was. It was a constant feature of life. We felt we were relatively safe because we thought it's unlikely there'll be a direct strike on the hospital, but for those 1.3, 1.4 million people in that green zone, they were constantly being bombed day and night. And what I think I found particularly disturbing was that a bomb would drop maybe on a crowded, tented area, and then the drones would come down and...
Please take your time. We're incredibly grateful that you're making the time to be here today, and I can only imagine just how it has impacted you and will continue to impact you. And I feel, because you can't unsee what you've seen, but being able to share that with us really helps us hold legislators particularly to account. So we do appreciate the time that you're making for us today. Thank you.
So the drones would come down and pick off civilians, children, and we had description after description. This is not, an occasional thing. This was day after day after day, operating on children who would say, I was lying on the ground after a bomb had dropped, and this quadcopter came down and hovered over me and shot me. And that's clearly a deliberate act, and it was a persistent act, persistent targeting of civilians day after day. We had 1 or 2 mass casualty incidents every day, and that meant 10 to 20 dead, 20 to 40 seriously injured. Now, a hospital like Guy's, where I used to work, Guy's and St Thomas's, might get 1 or 2 a year. We had 1 or 2 a day. And 60 to 70% of the people we treated were women and children.
I'm sorry to do this, draw you a little. You say children. I wonder if you could tell us sort of the ages of the children. And you say that they said that they were lying on the ground from a bomb shock. Do you believe them?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, a 7-year-old's not going to make up a story.
We're talking little children,
yeah.
not late teens.
Well, from the majority of the children who were casualties were young children, but we had casualties in their teens, we had women in their 30s, and it was a very consistent story. And the story would be given as soon as they came into the emergency department. So I have absolutely no reason to doubt this. And the bullets that the drones fire are these small cuboid pellets. And I fished a number of those out of the abdomen of small children. I think the youngest I operated on was a 3-year-old who had a major injury to the artery in her neck. And we used the last shunt, which is a device you use to bypass the artery in the neck to keep supplying blood to the brain. We used the last one in the hospital because those kinds of things are just not available. She died about 3 or 4 days later from infection.
You believe it was deliberate targeting of civilians?
Absolutely, there's absolutely no question in my mind, and it's been the experience of so many healthcare workers who've documented it time and time and time again. But my personal experience and those of my colleagues this was clearly persistent, deliberate targeting of civilians. And I've worked in a number of conflict zones in different parts of the world. I was there at the time of the Rwandan genocide. I've never seen anything on this scale, ever, and that was also the view of all the experienced colleagues that I worked with. One of the surgeons in my team had been to Ukraine 5 times and said, this is 10 times worse. Normally in a conflict zone, you would have a front line, you'd have fighting going on between 2 sets of forces, and you might get some civilians injured in that exchange. There doesn't seem to be a front line. There just seems to be 1.4 million people trapped, they can't leave, and having bombs dropped on them on a daily basis, and then drones coming in and shooting them. And there's plenty of evidence out there from Israeli soldiers that that's what's going on, but we saw it. We saw the results of it.
The October 7th attacks by Hamas and Israel's genocidal response have shaken several Middle Eastern countries to their foundations. That includes Israel itself, where the news media provide a window into a nation initially gripped by grief that then turned to revenge. That picture, however, has started to shift at the liberal end of the Israeli spectrum. Expressions of guilt, even anger over the onslaught in Gaza have been surfacing, with more and more Israeli voices using terms such as ethnic cleansing, even genocide, to describe it. And there is alarm over how Israel's devastation of Gaza may come home to roost, sparked by the news that Brazil launched an investigation into an Israeli soldier on holiday there for war crimes, and the implications that has for hundreds of other soldiers who have incriminated themselves on social media, which is why 46,000 Palestinian lives later, the Israeli army has now taken extraordinary steps when it comes to both the mainstream media and social media to stop showing the faces of its homegrown war criminals. 4 interviews on the genocide Israel continues to inflict on Palestinians in Gaza. 2 from Israel, done over Zoom, since Al Jazeera has been banned there. 1 from the U.S., and 1 with a Palestinian human rights researcher in central Gaza. What is left of it?
We're talking about 80% of the population that even if they were allowed to go to their homes, they will not actually find homes. They will live on the rubble. This suffering will continue for decades, not just years, decades.
Despite all the evidence, much of it posted by its own soldiers on social media, Israel still insists it's not committing war crimes, let alone a genocide. But more and more countries see past the propaganda. Like Brazil, where a judge recently ordered that an Israeli soldier on holiday there be investigated for his role in Gaza. The Israelis got him out before charges could be laid. The case produced a panicky response in Israeli news studios because of its implications.
ארגנטינה, צ'ילה, ברזיל, מדינות שיש להם סמכות שיפוט אוניברסלית ומאוד קל להעמיד, וכמובן תאילנד, יעד פופולרי שמחפשים שם משרד עורכי דין, וזה כנראה ילך ויגבר, אבל...
Army chiefs then declared that from now on, the identities of Israeli soldiers will be hidden from the world, their faces blurred in interviews, plus a ban on soldiers posting their exploits on social media. It's too little, much too late. Soldiers have already provided mountains of online evidence for war crimes investigators, which, as a former Israeli Army Chief of Staff pointed out, is not the only evidence out there.
שיפסיקו להוציא החוצה כל מיני סרטונים וכל מיני אמירות, אבל זה לא יעזור להם, הפוליטיקאים ידברו על זה שבעצם אנחנו מתכוונים לדלל או לנקות האוכלוסייה, זה פשע מלחמה הזו.
The Israeli news outlet Ya'alon was speaking on, Ynet, has since posted an online guide for Israeli soldiers on how to avoid arrest overseas and what to do if that happens.
Their own soldiers have been taking to social media, going on Instagram, going on TikTok, and posting videos of war crimes. So part of the reason why Israel is in this crisis is because their own soldiers have been going onto social media and broadcasting their own war crimes.
The fact that there has been an article in one of the mainstream Israeli web portals saying, here's a guide for reservists about how to protect yourself when you go abroad, so you don't fall under threat of prosecution. This is a kind of mind-boggling thing that Israelis didn't really ever have to worry about. But those kinds of efforts to prosecute them have only been possible when those very same soldiers themselves have incriminated themselves in war crimes.
There's been an explicit push to delete social media posts, certain things you shouldn't say in public, which is rather startling because instead of saying, if you think they are war crimes, you shouldn't partake in them, you should refuse, the push is, this is how you should hide them. The shame isn't translated into taking action in refusing to partake in the genocide, but rather to sort of be ashamed that the world sees us in this position. We should hide it better.
Other changes in the Israeli media space include some of the terminology now seeping into the debate. That ex-army chief of staff, Moshe Ya'alon, set off shockwaves in early December by openly calling Israel's tactics in Gaza ethnic cleansing.
או ללכת בדרך שכרגע גוררים אותנו, לכבוש, לספח, לטהר טיהור אתני, תסתכלו על צפון הרצועה.
As if emboldened by Ya'alon, a collection of center-left voices has since followed his lead, some of them injecting another taboo term, genocide, into the discussion. International audiences have been hearing such terminology for months, a problem the Israeli government is now spending more money on. It has made a dramatic increase to its Hasbara or propaganda budget, allocating another $150 million to target the foreign press, social media platforms, and college campuses, treating the symptoms rather than curing the disease.
I don't think the start of improving Israel's image is to write a nice message, to trot out the right people who look earnest in conversation abroad.
The thing that the Israeli government wants more than anything is to bring back our people.
I don't dismiss the necessity of communication, but it has to start from a genuine change of reality and political policy.
In terms of the amount of money, $150 million increase to what they were already going to spend on public diplomacy, it just underscores the extent of the crisis here. You can't put lipstick on a pig, and no amount of money spent on public diplomacy is going to be able to erase all of these images that people have been seeing now on social media.
The circular relationship between Israel and the world is such that Israel does something objectionable or criticizable, and then the world criticizes it, and then Israel cries anti-Semitism.
The singling out of the one and only Jewish state.
And then Israel invests in money and effort to show the world why actually the world is anti-Semitic and it is always right. Israel is just investing all its efforts into changing its image rather than rethinking its actions.
All of this is unfolding as Israel presses on with its attacks on Gaza, including what remains of its hospitals and media corps. The day after Christmas, 5 employees of Al-Quds, a TV news outlet affiliated with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, were killed in an airstrike, the worst massacre of journalists of the entire war. Babies, forced to live in tents, are succumbing to hypothermia, freezing to death. Ceasefire talks have resumed, but there is little to no reason to believe that Israel will meet Hamas's demand for a full withdrawal from Gaza. The pressure on Israel to return to the negotiating table intensified last weekend after Hamas released a video of one of the few dozen captives said to be still alive, a 19-year-old named Liri Albag.
Liri Elbag has been one of the more prominent hostages in the Israeli consciousness because her family have been very outspoken. In the video, she's like a shell of a human being in very poor physical condition. Hamas has been releasing these kinds of videos to generate public demands towards a ceasefire deal. The Israeli government call it psychological terror. Israelis don't care what you call it. The growing majority are willing to end the war for the sake of getting the hostages back.
The video of Liri Albag hasn't been broadcast in Israeli mainstream media in its full. The use of uniform here is applied by Hamas. It's to remind Israelis that she is a soldier. It's a reminder of the contradictions of the deep militarism of Israeli society that sends 19-year-old girls to serve in the military, but then still treats them as young women, like they're still the vulnerable young women that they actually are. It is incredibly hard for all of us to watch these videos.
On the captives, there's another much larger group that gets minimal Israeli or international attention. The Palestinians rotting away in Israeli jails in their thousands. A wildly disproportionate amount of the focus goes to the dozens of Israeli captives who have yet to be brought home, and away from the bigger picture, the genocide in Gaza, a population now made up almost entirely of refugees, living in tents, as Israeli bombs keep raining down in places like Deir al-Balah.
Deir al-Balah now houses more than 1 million Palestinians concentrated in this pretty much refugee camp. Is very dangerous. The smallest bomb dropped on any neighborhood in Deir al-Balah can result in a massacre. This genocide on Gaza, it was never about only releasing the hostages. Israel wanted to teach the Palestinians a lesson to destroy the whole of the Gaza Strip. And even if Israel were to agree to a ceasefire deal now, the attacks will continue on Palestinians in the whole of Palestine.
We'll close this edition of our program with a special presentation by the Indian writer Arundhati Roy. In 2024, she received the Pen Printer Award, which she shared with Egyptian writer Abdel Fattah. The award is given to writers who demonstrate courage in the art of creating literature and in expressing themselves. Ms. Roy took the opportunity when receiving the award to speak to the crisis in Gaza and in Palestine, and her words are memorable to say the least. Here now is Arundhati Roy, Indian writer, on the occasion of receiving the 2024 Pen Printer Award.
When Benjamin Netanyahu holds up a map of the Middle East in which Palestine has been erased and Israel stretches from the river to the sea, he is applauded as a visionary who's working to realize the dream of a Jewish homeland. But when Palestinians and their supporters chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," they are accused of explicitly calling for the genocide of Jews.
And absolutely delighted, and personally, I'm delighted to meet you. Thank you very much for coming.
I thank you, members of English Pen and members of the jury, for honoring me with the Pen Pinter Prize. And I'd like to begin by announcing the name of this year's Writer of Courage, who I've chosen to share this award with. My greetings to you, Allah Abdel Fattah, writer of courage, and my fellow awardee. We hoped and prayed that you would be released in September, but the Egyptian government decided that you were too beautiful and too dangerous a thinker to be freed yet. But you are here in this room with us. You are the most important person here. From prison, you wrote, I quote, "My words lost any power, and yet they continue to pour out of me. I still had a voice, even if only a handful would listen." Unquote. We are listening, Allah, closely. Greetings to you too, my beloved Naomi Klein, friend to both Allah and me. Thank you for being here tonight. It means the world to me. And greetings to all of you gathered here, as well as to those who are invisible perhaps to this wonderful audience, but as visible to me as anybody else in this room. I'm speaking of my friends and comrades in prison in India, lawyers, academics, students, journalists, Umar Khalid, Gulfisha Fatima, Khalid Saifi, Sharjeel Imam, Rona Wilson, Surendra Gadling, Mahesh Raut. I speak to you too, my friend Khurram Parvez, one of the most remarkable people I know. You've been in prison for 3 years. And you too, Irfan Mehraj, and to the thousands incarcerated in Kashmir and across the country whose lives have been devastated. When Ruth Borthwick, chair of English Pen and of the Pinter panel, first wrote to me about this honor, she said, "The Pen Pinter Prize is awarded to a writer who has sought to define, quote, the real truth of our lives and our societies through unflinching, unswerving, fierce intellectual determination." That's a quote from Harold Pinter's Nobel Prize acceptance speech. The word unflinching made me pause for a moment, because I think of myself as someone who's almost permanently flinching. I would like to dwell a little on the theme of flinching and unflinching, which may be best illustrated by Harold Pinter himself. And I quote, "I was present at a meeting at the US Embassy in London in the late 1980s. The United States Congress was about to decide whether to give more money to the Contras in their campaign against the state of Nicaragua. I was a member of a delegation speaking on behalf of Nicaragua, but the most important member of this delegation was a Father John Metcalf. The leader of the US body was Raymond Seitz, then number 2 to the ambassador, later ambassador himself. Father Metcalf said, "Sir, I'm in charge of a parish in the north of Nicaragua. My parishioners built a school, a healthcare center, a cultural center. We have lived in peace. A few months ago, a Contra force attacked the parish. They destroyed everything, the school, the health center, the cultural center. They raped nurses and teachers, slaughtered doctors in the most brutal manner. They behaved like savages. Please demand that the US government withdraw its support from this shocking terrorist activity." Raymond Seitz had a very good reputation as a rational, responsible, and highly sophisticated man. He was greatly respected in diplomatic circles. He listened, paused, and then spoke with some gravity. "Father," he said, "let me tell you something. In war, innocent people always suffer." There was a frozen silence. We stared at him. He did not flinch. Unquote. Remember that President Reagan called the Contras, quote, the moral equivalent of our founding fathers, a turn of phrase that he was clearly fond of. He also used it to describe the CIA-backed Afghan Mujahideen, who then morphed into the Taliban, and it is the Taliban who rule Afghanistan today, after waging a 20-year-long war against the US invasion and occupation. Before the Contras and the Mujahideen, there was the war in Vietnam and the unflinching US military doctrine that ordered its soldiers to kill anything that moves. If you read the Pentagon Papers and other documents on US war aims in Vietnam, you can enjoy some lively, unflinching discussions about how to commit genocide. Is it better to kill people outright or starve them slowly? Which would look better? The problem that the compassionate mandarins in the Pentagon faced was that, unlike Americans, who, according to them, want, I quote, life, happiness, wealth, power, Asians stoically accept the destruction of wealth and the loss of lives and force America to carry their, quote, strategic logic to its conclusion, which is genocide, unquote. A terrible burden to be borne unflinchingly. And here we are all these years later, more than a year into yet another genocide. The US and Israel's unflinching and ongoing televised genocide in Gaza and now Lebanon in defense of a colonial occupation and an apartheid state. The death toll so far is officially 42,000, a majority of them women and children. This does not include those who died screaming under the rubble of buildings, neighborhoods, whole cities, and whose bodies have not yet been recovered. A recent study by Oxfam says that more children have been killed by Israel in Gaza than in the equivalent period of any other war in the last 20 years. To assuage their collective guilt for their early years of indifference towards one genocide, the Nazi extermination of millions of European Jews, the United States and Europe have prepared the grounds for another. Like every state that has carried out ethnic cleansing and genocide in history, Zionists in Israel, who believe themselves to be the chosen people, began by dehumanizing Palestinians before driving them off their land and murdering them. Prime Minister Menachem Begin called Palestinians two-legged beasts. Yitzhak Rabin called them grasshoppers who could be crushed. And Golda Meir said there was no such thing as Palestinians. Winston Churchill, that famous warrior against fascism, said, "I do not admit that the dog in the manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time," and then went on to declare that a higher race had the final right to the manger. Once those two-legged beasts, grasshoppers, dogs, and non-existent people were murdered, ethnically cleansed and ghettoized, a new country was born. It was celebrated as a land without people for a people without a land. The nuclear-armed state of Israel was to serve as a military outpost and gateway to the natural wealth and resources of the Middle East for Europe and the US, a lovely coincidence of aims and objectives. The new state was supported unhesitatingly and unflinchingly, armed and bankrolled, coddled and applauded, no matter what crimes it committed. It grew up like a protected child in a wealthy home whose parents smile proudly as it commits atrocity upon atrocity. No wonder today it feels free to boast openly about committing genocide. At least the Pentagon Papers were secret. They had to be stolen and leaked. No wonder Israeli soldiers seem to have lost all sense of decency. No wonder they flood the social media with depraved videos of themselves wearing the lingerie of women they have killed or displaced. Videos of themselves mimicking dying Palestinians and wounded children or raped and tortured prisoners. Images of themselves blowing up buildings while they smoke cigarettes or jive to music on their headphones. Who are these people? What can possibly justify what Israel is doing? The answer, according to Israel and its allies, as well as the Western media, is the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th last year. the killing of Israeli citizens, and the taking of Israeli hostages. According to them, history only began a year ago. So this is the part in my speech where I am expected to equivocate to protect myself, my neutrality, and my intellectual standing. This is the part where I'm meant to lapse into moral equivalence and condemn Hamas, the other militant groups in Gaza, and their ally Hezbollah in Lebanon for killing citizens, taking people hostage, and to condemn the people of Gaza who celebrated the Hamas attack. Once that's done, it all becomes easy, doesn't it? Ah, well, everyone's terrible. What can one do? Let's go shopping instead. I refuse to play the condemnation game. Let me make myself clear. I do not tell oppressed people how to resist their oppression or who their allies should be. When the US President Joe Biden met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli War Cabinet during a visit to Israel in October 2023, he said, "I don't believe you have to be a Jew to be a Zionist, and I am a Zionist." Unlike President Joe Biden, who calls himself a non-Jewish Zionist and unflinchingly bankrolls and arms Israel while it commits its war crimes, I'm not going to declare myself or define myself in any way that is narrower than my writing. I am what I write. I'm acutely aware that being the writer that I am, the non-Muslim that I am, and the woman that I am, it would be difficult, perhaps impossible, for me to survive very long under the rule of Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Iranian regime. But that is not the point here. The point is to educate ourselves about the history and the circumstances under which they came to exist. The point is that right now they are fighting against an ongoing genocide. The point is to ask ourselves whether a liberal, secular fighting force can go up against a genocidal war machine. Because when all the powers of the world are arrayed against them, who do they have to turn to but God? I'm aware that Hezbollah and the Iranian regime have vocal detractors in their own countries, some who also languish in jails or who have faced far worse outcomes. I'm aware that some of their actions, the killing of civilians and the taking of hostages on October 7th by Hamas, constitute war crimes. However, there cannot be an equivalence between this and what Israel and the United States are doing in Gaza, in the West Bank, and now in Lebanon. The root of all the violence, including the violence of October 7th, is Israel's occupation of Palestinian land and its subjugation of the Palestinian people. History did not begin on October 7th, 2023. I ask you, which of us sitting in this hall would willingly submit to the indignity that Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank have been subjected to for decades? What peaceful means have the Palestinian people not tried? What compromise have they not accepted, other than the one that requires them to crawl on their knees and eat dirt? Israel is not fighting a war of self-defense. It is fighting a war of aggression, a war to occupy more territory, to strengthen its apartheid apparatus, and tighten its control on Palestinian people and the region. Since October 7th, 2023, apart from the tens of thousands of people it has killed, Israel has displaced the majority of Gaza's population many times over. It has bombed hospitals, it has deliberately targeted and killed doctors, aid workers, and journalists. A whole population is being starved. Their history is sought to be erased. All this is supported both morally and materially by the wealthiest, most powerful governments in the world and their media. And here I include my country, India, which supplies Israel with weapons as well as thousands of workers. There is no daylight between these countries and Israel. In the last year alone, the US has spent $17.9 billion in military aid to Israel. So let us once and for all dispense with the lie about the US being a mediator, a restraining influence, or as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, considered to be on the extreme left of mainstream US politics, put it, working tirelessly for a ceasefire. A party to the genocide cannot be a mediator. Not all the power and money, not all the weapons and propaganda on earth can any longer hide the wound that is Palestine, the wound through which the whole world, including Israel, bleeds. Polls show that a majority of the citizens in the countries whose governments enable the Israeli genocide have made it clear that they do not agree with this. We have watched the marches of hundreds of thousands of people, including a young generation of Jews who are tired of being used, tired of being lied to. Who would have imagined that we would live to see the day when German police would arrest Jewish citizens for protesting against Israel and Zionism and accuse them of anti-Semitism? Who would have thought that the US government would, in the service of the Israeli state, undermine its cardinal principle of free speech by banning pro-Palestine slogans? The so-called moral architecture of Western democracies, with a few honorable exceptions, has become a grim laughingstock in the rest of the world. When Benjamin Netanyahu holds up a map of the Middle East in which Palestine has been erased and Israel stretches from the river to the sea, he is applauded as a visionary who's working to realize the dream of a Jewish homeland. But when Palestinians and their supporters chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," they are accused of explicitly calling for the genocide of Jews. Are they really? Or is that a sick imagination projecting its own darkness onto others? An imagination that cannot countenance diversity, cannot countenance the idea of living in a country alongside other people, equally with equal rights, like everybody else in the world does. An imagination that cannot afford to acknowledge that Palestinians want to be free, like South Africa is, like India is, like all countries that have thrown off the yoke of colonialism are, countries that are diverse, deeply, maybe even fatally flawed, but free. When South Africans were chanting their popular rallying cry, Amandla, power to the people, were they calling for the genocide of white people? They were not. They were calling for the dismantling of the apartheid state, just as Palestinians are. The war that has begun now will be terrible, but it will eventually dismantle Israeli apartheid. The whole world will be far safer for everyone, including for Jewish people, and far more just. It will be like pulling an arrow from our wounded heart. If the US government withdrew its support of Israel, the war could stop today. Hostilities could end right this minute. Israeli hostages could be freed, Palestinian prisoners could be freed, the negotiations with Hamas and the other Palestinian stakeholders that must inevitably follow the war could instead take place now and prevent the suffering of millions of people. How sad that most people would consider that a naive and laughable proposition. As I conclude, let me turn to your words, Allah Abdel Fattah, from your book of prison writing called "You Have Not Been Defeated." I have rarely read such beautiful words about the meaning of victory and defeat and the political necessity of honestly looking despair in the eye. I've rarely seen writing in which a citizen separates himself from the state, from the generals, and even from the slogans of the square with such bell-like clarity. And I quote, "The center is treason because there's room in it only for the general. The center is treason and I have never been a traitor. They think they've pushed us back into the margins. They don't realize that we never left it. We just got lost for a brief while. Neither the ballot boxes, nor the palaces, or the ministries, or the prisons, or even the graves are big enough for our dreams. We never sought the center because it has no room except for those who abandoned the dream. Even the square was not big enough for us, so most of the battles of the revolution happened outside it, and most of the heroes remained outside the frame. End quote. As the horror we are witnessing in Gaza and now Lebanon quickly escalates into a regional war, its real heroes remain outside the frame, but they fight on because they know that one day, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. It will. Keep your eye on your calendar, not on your clock, because that's how the people, not the generals, but the people fighting for their liberation measure time. Thank you.
That's our program. As always, thank you for watching. We'll see you down the road.